Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kootenay-Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to admit that when the topic of political financing reform comes up, many Canadians' eyes glaze over. It isn't the most exciting subject in front of this Parliament, and yet today we've heard, I think it'll be 18 or 19 speakers on this topic, pointing out both the strengths and the weaknesses of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I wish the House rules permitted the same level of debate on some of the very important private member bills that come before this House, and perhaps we can work together to see that happen in the future. However, Bill C-50 is important. We only have to look south of the border to see what happens when there are no controls over who donates to elected representatives or how much they can donate. During the recent U.S. debate over net neutrality, another exciting subject, companies and groups on both sides of the issue lobbied with their wallets. According to OpenSecrets.com, of the 535 members of Congress, 495 received campaign contributions from groups who lobbied the Federal Communications Commission on net neutrality. The telecoms, opposed to net neutrality, donated millions, and the Republicans fell in line. The result will be a more limited, more expensive Internet experience for Americans. Thankfully, here in Canada, we have largely constrained such obvious vote buying, but that hasn't always been the case. In advance of the 1872 election, Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald and his colleagues sought out campaign contributions from a Montreal shipping magnate named Hugh Allen. Allen donated, which would have been a fortune back in 1872, $350,000 to Macdonald's Conservative government, and he was rewarded for that donation. The Canadian Encyclopedia says, after the election, a railway syndicate organized by Allen was rewarded with the lucrative contract to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, the transcontinental railroad promised to British Columbia when it joined Confederation. Known as the Pacific Scandal, news of the Rail for Cash deal eventually forced the resignation of the Macdonald government. More recently, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was implicated in a scandal that became known as the Airbus affair. My own province of British Columbia used to be the case study for what happens when there are insufficient campaign financing laws. In fact, a year ago, the New York Times called British Columbia the Wild West of Canadian political cash, citing the former provincial Liberal government for its many conflicts of interest and describing the unabashedly cozy relationship, and this is a quote, between private interests and government officials in the province. They cited BC for having no limits on political donations and repeated criticisms that under the Christie-Clark regime, and I quote, the provincial government has been transformed into a lucrative business dominated by special interests that trade donations for political favours, undermining Canada's reputation for functional, census-driven democracy. Thankfully, the new NDP government under Premier John Horgan immediately brought in political finance reforms, including bans on corporate and union donations and limiting individual donations to $1,200 per year. It's good to see civil reforms brought to the Wild West. Meanwhile, with the current federal Liberal government, we've seen the Cash for Access scandal, where lobbyists were sold exclusive access to the Prime Minister by simply buying high-priced tickets to Liberal fundraising events. During the last election, the Liberal Party made a promise to close political financing loops altogether. As we look at Bill C-50, the legislation before us today, we see only a timid attempt at that direction. This bill will force some party fundraising events to be advertised 5 days in advance, and it will ensure that the names of those attending the function are published. The new rules apply to events attended by cabinet ministers, party leaders, and some leadership candidates. The NDP offered amendments at committee to include parliamentary secretaries and senior political staff, but the Liberal members voted down those amendments. Observers should note that Liberal government's parliamentary secretaries are subject to the Conflict of Interest Act, But with Bill C-50, however, they are exempt from the transparency rules aimed at cash for access events. At the end of the day, cash for access events will still go ahead. We'll just know a little bit more about them. So, is the government closing political financing loopholes and meeting their campaign promise? Not at all. What should this bill contain? A 2016 Globe and Mail editorial titled "Money and Politics: How to End the Corruption and Conflict of Interest" said that individual donation limits should be low, possibly as low as $100. These rules should apply at all times, including election years and during party leadership campaigns. So that's from the Globe and Mail editorial. Well, I'm not sure about the amount. Lowering the limit would absolutely take big money out of the political picture. No longer could wealthier Canadians expect to meet with cabinet ministers or the Prime Minister because only they can afford the steep price tag. On another issue, a 2017 Senate report titled "Controlling Foreign Influence in Canadian Elections" found that, and I quote again, "current law does not sufficiently protect Canadian elections from being influenced by foreign entities, whether through direct interference or by providing funding to third parties." Their recommendations, well worth the consideration of this chamber, include a provision that more clearly states that any attempt made by foreign entities to induce Canadian electors to vote in a particular way should be prohibited. Removal of the 6-month limitation on the requirement to report contributions made to third parties for the purposes of election advertising, and a requirement that Elections Canada perform random audits of third parties' election advertising expenses and any contributions they have received. So that's from the Senate report. These are provisions I would like to see examined further, Mr. Speaker. Currently in my riding of Kootenay-Columbia, I am often asked about issues that constituents have learned about through media websites. Unfortunately, in many cases, these web news sites turn out to be politically prejudiced, often racist, and in some cases are heavily influenced by foreign elements. They mislead, they scaremonger, and they prevent fact-based political discourse. Finally, I would like to point to Bill C-364, introduced by the member for Terrebonne. His bill would sharply restrict individual donations while bringing back a formula for public subsidies to campaigns. While C-364 has not yet had a rigorous review by this House, it is certainly raising some excellent issues that I would like to have seen considered within Bill C-50. Too often, money equals power. But in this place, money should have no influence. While I will be supporting this bill as at least a first baby step in the right direction, I am disappointed that the Liberal government has missed this opportunity to truly strengthen Canada's political financing laws to truly prevent influence peddling and cash for access. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires.